We go. Welcome. This is the April 1st edition of the Grafana community. Sorry, Loki community call. Rather kind of short agenda today. A couple things to chat on. The sort of Loki squad has been pretty heads down on kind of cleaning up some of our internal work, and some of our team members are on loan to other teams. Raise your hand, Owen. Um, so the news this month is a little light, but there's still some interesting stuff to talk about. I think I'll start with the 2.2 release because I'm pretty sure I talked about that in at least. Let me share the agenda here. All right. Go back and look to see how long ago I talked about 2.2. Yeah, very soon, last month. Right on it. Yep, 2 months ago. Well, I don't even want to go back further than that. So anyway, 2.2 was released, and 2.2.1 we'll do probably today or tomorrow, mainly for this bug right here, these two bugs, 3550 and 3502. I would warn everyone in the sort of strongest terms, if you're using the pack and unpack features. So I don't suspect many people are, because we didn't really advertise much of this. We added it to kind of support some use cases that we were trying to better handle. I think I talked about it last time. So the idea is with pack and unpack that you can take some very high cardinality source of logs. So in our example, we were working with a CI system that basically just generates pods as part of the build, like thousands and thousands and thousands of them. And typically our Kubernetes scrape configs would have pods as pod name as a label. But in this case, that ends up with so much cardinality that it can become a little bit heavy for the index in Loki. Normal pod churn usually isn't a problem, but this specific use case was basically doing its best to generate pods as fast as possible. So what pack would do in Promtail is lets you take labels and, like pod, for example, and insert it into the log line. So we would take the normal log line, wrap it in a JSON object, and then let you select labels and put them, instead of putting them in the index, they get shipped with the log line. So this is a little bit of a stopgap until some better things come along in Loki. Specifically like some overhaul to the storage to give us more ability to handle higher cardinality. But in the meantime, if you find yourself in a use case where you're churning huge amounts of labels for something that you don't want to remove, so that pod label was still valuable for the querying here. So that was what pack and unpack were for. So the unpack command sits in Loki, and it unwraps that and uses, it's the equivalent, it's like syntactic sugar for a JSON parser, and then doing a line format to replace the line. However, it had a pretty nasty bug where when it did that, it actually rewrote the log line and permanently. So, unfortunate. We were trying to optimize for performance and push the bar a little bit too far there. So if you were or are interested in the pack and unpack, then you're going to want 2.2.1. And the split shard creation bug, if anybody's upgraded and they find that they're getting errors that say end time must be after start time, that's related to this. Usually hits on longer query durations, but that should fix that. And I think I'm also going to cherry pick this label allow stage, because it's sort of a nicer way to kind of get control over what labels are sent out of Promtail than having to do it with relabel configs, and it actually gives you some more control over that because relabel configs happen before the pipeline stages. So that should be an easy one to add in there too.
Can you talk about what label allow does?
Yeah, so we have a label drop stage now, which you can essentially, drop list any number of labels that you don't want to send to Loki, but that's cumbersome if it doesn't do like regex matching or anything. So that's cumbersome if you don't know the sets of labels. So label allow is the other approach, with an allow list approach, where you can say, I only want to send namespace, cluster, pod, just examples. Only those 3 labels are allowed to be sent, and everything else is dropped. That's kind of a lot more tenable approach for dynamic environments where the label set might be out of control. This can be useful too. So the default scrape config that we've shipped from day one in the Helm chart and JSON, it automatically includes all pod labels as indexed labels in Loki. And in hindsight, I feel that this is a mistake. It's especially been.
Didn't we change this? I think I PR'd to change this.
I don't think it's changed in Helm. He changed it in the promtail.sh file. Like that's the only place it's changed, which is most people aren't using unless they're doing the Grafana Cloud install path. But this is as far as I know. I'm pretty sure this is still the default, because I think to change it, it would need to be communicated well, because it's going to cause labels. Like, so if we remove that, then it's a pretty noticeably changed behavior that people might be relying on. But the problem is, and we see it more and more now with Istio, because Istio wants to put like 700 or 800 labels on a pod, and 20, still way more than what we really want for Loki, and they don't really add any useful context in the format of how you would query for logs for an app. But it is the case, and Istio's not. I mean, there's a number of places where pod labels are added. I mean, we do it internally for different reasons, and then those became index labels, but they're sort of almost never something you would query by, or maybe shouldn't be, and that ends up with either hitting the label limit, the default of 15, or sort of causing other trouble that it just sort of unnecessarily grows the index. So I would like to walk that behavior back at some point and remove that from the scrape config, but in a hopefully well communicated way. But in the sort of interim, you can use the label allow stage to just specifically allow list labels that you want to send through, and also address that.
I think that this is a really interesting problem that we have, because it's illustrative of like knowing there's a better way to do something, but feeling like it's really hard for us to make what we kind of consider a backwards incompatible change, right? And like I think that there's been a couple examples historically where this has kind of been the case. And like how do we choose what option to take, right? Do we make the choice that makes things better in the long run, right? Like that moves us towards a more ideal scenario, but that causes like some migration pain, for instance, right? Like if we did this and we change it in the Helm charts, for instance, suddenly, people might run into more problems with like out of order errors, for instance. Like that could be something that we'd see, and like that's not great, right? Like the user experience on surfacing that and then fixing it is like pretty terrible right now, right? Is this another thing that I can segue into the ordering constraint, Ed? And while we're here, let me talk.
I mean, technically, I don't think this can affect the ordering constraint because it's a pod label, so it's not going to change at runtime. But I guess if you weren't using a pod label and you were using this instead, then yes, it could. So it could. All right, I'll give it to you.
All right. And it's recorded.
Historically, I've been of the opinion that it's better to make small breaking changes for the long-term sanity of the project and its maintainers. And as a result, I always really recommend everyone look at the upgrade guide to really do our best to over-communicate that, as well as try to have changes that are breaking be sort of immediately obvious. This one is harder though, because it's not going to like fail to start or anything like that. It's just a behavior change in what you were seeing versus what you'd start seeing. It's also technically, the Helm charts are in a separate repo. The JSON, it's like they're sort of versioned a little bit differently than the project. So we could do it as part of a release of the project, but it doesn't really make sense to tie those together. I think at some point we just need to decide to do it, because in the long run, I don't think it makes sense to continue adding all pod labels.
Yeah, I mean this one. Yeah, I
yes,
agree.
I think right now it's just like
I think there's two categories of types of errors right here, right? The first one is, oh, I used to use this pod label to query, right? And now it's not there, which like that kind of sucks, but is okay. The other one is, I'm not ingesting logs anymore, and that's that's pretty bad, right? Like that one really hurts because you have to go figure that out. The tooling for figuring out exactly how to do it is not super easy to discover if you're relatively new to Loki. This particular example could be something that we delay until we change the ordering constraint, right? But maybe that's a choice we could make.
Yeah. I don't know. It's one of those things that needs to be done, and not really looking forward to it. But just it's not ideal, right? Like to have to make changes like that. But in the long run, it will benefit everyone, in my opinion. All right. I saw your note, Diana. I think Diana wants to demo the new. So Grafana 7.5 was released, and with that was a new label browser in Loki. I did come up with something as well, but if you want to demo, I'd be more than happy to.
Oh, probably you should
sharing.
demo. I just was offering mine because it definitely only has my computer's stuff on it. But I would like to demo the site search at some point because it's kind of cool.
Okay. Did that? I'm assuming you're looking at an Explore screen on my screen.
Yes, we can see your Explore screen.
Yeah. So the historically, when you were over here next to, I don't know how well my pointer is visible, but it's bigger just in case. Pointer visible. So this log would be a drop-down list, and they would just list labels. So in 7.5, you now have a label browser or log browser. Really, it's a label browser, but won't criticize anyone's choice of words because I'm terrible at everything I've ever named, which is probably going to be evident in these labels. This is a Loki instance that I run at home. So the way this works is you basically have the option now to sort of select a label. So job labels are pretty consistently applied in most kind of Prometheus and Loki scrape configs. And then if you click it, this is going to show you basically contextually what other labels you would find as on logs that were shipped with a job label. And so let me do. Yeah, so I'm sorry, those are the values that are available. And then when I select the values, now you can see here that the other labels that are accessible for that are highlighted too. So if I start with just job, right? So there's no, within any of these particular labels. So like I only know that time fidget has the type label, but and a version labels, that's probably the best example here. And you can kind of keep adding these. And as you do that, it builds you a label selector, and you can, validate as well as show logs for it, and it will auto apply that label selector. So honestly, this is really nice compared to in the search field too, which is really handy if you want to search for values. My setup here has very few labels and very few values, so that's very easy to click through, but that's often not the case on bigger installations. So this is like I said, new. So feedback definitely encouraged. If people have use cases where they'd like to see this, improved or features. Those should be made in the Grafana repo, github.com/Grafana/Grafana, because this falls into the front end side of things. But by all means, everyone enjoy.
I think a big shout out to David Kaltschmidt for that one?
Yeah.
Didn't he just implement that, right? And like no one had really asked about it. It just came up one day. It was like, hey, I've got this thing.
There was a lot of UX work done on that. By the way, is actually a great segue because the Grafana YouTube channel, by the way, exists, and we've been posting community calls like these and our UX feedback sessions there. And there was a UX feedback session yesterday where we talked about Loki pagination. So that should be posted in public in a few days. And so if you guys have feedback or commentary when that's posted, take a look and tell us your thoughts on that, because that will help affect what the end result is. So here is a link to our Grafana YouTube. And highly recommend checking some of those things out. There's a lot of great content.
Definitely. All right. So Diana, you mentioned you had something you wanted to demo. I'm happy to.
Yes, I do.
hand over the.
Okay. So the website team is constantly improving stuff. So can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Yep.
All right. So just today or yesterday, they added this teeny tiny little icon so you can do a site-wide Grafana search. And if, for instance, you don't really know for sure what you want, you can type in that search and it will search everything, or you can limit it by content type there. And this will search both our documentation and it will search at webinar descriptions, it'll search at blog posts, all sorts of stuff. So let's say I just want Loki blog post because I saw Loki blog post a while ago and want to find it, or that I want let's say the Loki product page. So I can get some of those. So anyway, check it out and maybe you'll find something new, like this cool webinar with observability with Loki 2.0. So thank you very much.
That sounds familiar, Owen.
Yeah, I made a stink about that accidentally.
But
they're
the
all public.
observability. Well, yeah, you and I did.
Is that what you're getting at?
I was talking about more of the fact that you and I did that webinar.
Oh.
We could talk about what the little scene that you threw too, if you want.
I mean, yeah, my tantrums. Yeah, I really like to have those on publicly recorded calls. It's really nice.
Are you
Make
kidding?
Sure, make sure you get yourself a
YouTube
manager that exposes you like that publicly.
This is getting weird. I gotta.
Anyways, I think now we have some process to like automatically publish like webinars and things like that we run that I think is like time gated by like a week or two for like requiring emails for signups. But the idea is that like we run these things, right? Especially from the engineering team, we really care about like presenting useful demos, and we want to then be able to use those as to like give people, examples or feedback, right? So I think this one in particular, right? Chance was asking me something on public Slack, and I was like, oh, hey, like I did something similar in this demo, and I couldn't find it. So now they're published.
Nice. I added. It's not merged yet, but it is under review. So Aditya, one of the Loki maintainers that has a real knack for adding really useful features, like label allow as an example, has a PR open for geo IP support. And I can't remember the name of the company everybody uses, but the idea is you can use the sort of standard databases. There's a range of them. Basically, there's like a free version. I think the part we have left to figure out is how to do the bundling of that, if we're going to do any bundling, or have that as an exercise for the user to download the database, and the Prompto would need a path to it. But these GeoIP databases would be able to take a IP address and return geolocation information around it that you can use to in a pipeline stage to enhance your log. There's a word I'm looking for there.
Enrichment.
That's the one. Yeah. So you can enrich your logs with GeoIP information. There's an issue around this with lots of thumbs ups on it. So I brought that up because that's something that hopefully will be in the next release. And then we did mention pagination. Pagination, take your pick. Should be coming in some form soon. My guess is probably the next release of Grafana, although maybe in beta at that point. But still, it's. I think this one's interesting to me because I've been using Loki for a couple of years now, and I've rarely find that paging stops me from doing what I want to do. It's just sort of changed the behaviors of how I use Loki. So I think this could clearly be the case where I'm biased by the tool that I work on and finding its best features, and not sort of managing its flaws. But usually what I end up doing to work within line limits is just aggressively filtering out log lines with matchers, or negative matchers to just remove lines I don't care about. That being said, the cases where I've really wished that I had pagination were when I, the most common is like looking at a syslog for a node, trying to just see if I can learn anything about why something happened, and I'm just kind of reading through log lines at that point, and that where the lines aren't sort of consistent enough or common enough to easily filter. And I don't mean to say that people don't have lots of use cases for paging their logs. I would say that I've done pretty well. I think we've all done pretty well without it, but it is coming. Better late than never. That's it. That's the most words I can use to fill time about the fewest amounts of topic items.
I think it is
on
interesting,
an agenda.
right? Like there's a greater trend of like we've noticed that some people use Loki in kind of different ways than we do internally, right? Another example would be the tailing, like the tail endpoint, right? I don't think unless I'm debugging tailing itself, I don't think I ever use that. Right?
Really? I use tailing all the time, man.
Really?
Every time I do a rollout or
Tail
deployment, I always tail.
Yeah, I mean, it's like basically one of our taglines, right? It's like,
Huh.
like
I can't believe you don't use it.
I actually,
I'm disappointed when you don't.
Yeah,
Yeah, every time I do
Slack integration that I wrote, because that's like the best thing for tail is like it's just like forwarding.
Yeah,
I should have maybe not said we don't do this.
Man.
Yeah. I don't do this.
just you. So this reminded me of another thing that I want to talk about, because there was an issue that was open this morning on the community.grafana, the discourse boards. Discourse, not Discord, discourse. So a common feedback we get, extremely common, and usually in the form like this issue was, of people being mad at us or disappointed with us, is the behavior of what they expect is different than what happens when they search for logs. And I have no judgment to pass on what people expect or like what's right or wrong here, but I just want to explain the reason a little bit and sort of talk about what our thoughts are on how to fix it and why it is the way it is. But what I'm specifically meaning is, if you run a query for logs only, so not a metric query, no rate, no count over time, no functions, you will get back at most a line limit. So by default, that's 1,000 log lines. The histogram that shows up on top of the logs is generated on the client side in Grafana based on the returned log lines. And so it at most can show 1,000 entries, or whatever your limit is set to, 2,000, 3,000, but it has some hard limit. Everyone's expectation appears to be that histogram will show you the entire histogram for the full duration of your query. We actually did that for a long time, and then it ended up looking like you didn't have any logs until the very end, and then all of a sudden you'd have logs because that's where the last 1,000 were. And then that was since changed to just show the histogram for the time period that we do have logs, because that's sort of less confusing, but it's also not, it has not removed this confusion or I would say unhappiness. It's a nice way that I feel like some of the comments that I read around this, where everyone's expectation is that histogram will show you the full query length and the volume of logs you would see. The reason it doesn't do that is pretty intrinsic to how Loki works. So this is the big difference between Loki and, let's say, Elasticsearch. I think in Elasticsearch, this type of query is less computationally expensive, and they're able to do this much easier, and as a result, basically set the bar for what this should look like. And I think that's why most people are unhappy when they have this experience. For Loki to tell you the rate of log lines for a time window, it has to go count all of them, every single one of them. And so by default, we chose not to do that, because a normal query can return 1,000 log lines in less than a second in most cases, right? Like we only can stop querying as soon as we get those 1,000 log lines. If you want to know what a histogram looks like, you can write a rate query. Just take your same query and put rate around it, and probably put sum around that, and you will get back that histogram. So it exists now. We've talked a lot about, should we just automatically do that, right? Like, should every query just submit 2 queries, the log query and the rate query? Maybe. This is the part where I have to be careful because I don't want to have to eat my words, but I don't personally find any value in that histogram. I've never used it in my life to answer a question. So I'll just back up from that saying I'm just very likely missing the use cases where that's really helpful. And also maybe it's just really easy for me to know because I helped build Loki that I can write a rate query, right? So I will absolutely admit that my understanding here and my use is heavily biased by my experiences and what I know about the tool. So in conclusion, I'll just stop talking here. We're not quite sure what the best solution to this is. I think an approximation maybe could help here, right? Like we've talked about having some special case around how we do things to kind of, give back an approximation for the number of log lines, like to give a meaningful histogram over the time range that's close enough. I absolutely would love to hear the use cases of it's just very likely maybe the case that the logs that I look at are sort of not, they don't vary enough in volume that histogram has value. So like everyone else could have a different use case. I don't mean to sound critical of anyone. I think this one's interesting to me because of how aggressively people tell us we're wrong about it or how bad it is that we don't do it. So that is sort of the basis for I would love to know why we're so wrong about it.
I think we're wrong about it here. I think we should do this.
How would you guys like to have that discussion? Is that something that you should open a discussion thread on the forum for? Is this something that should go in Slack or GitHub issues? Or how would you guys like to hear about that?
Probably. I mean, the context around this is this discussion has been happening in many different forums for the past couple, years? So there's just kind of like a lot of baggage around it. It turns out that,
and I don't know. It's a hard problem for Loki to solve. And my general question here is this the problem that the Loki community wants us to solve? There's lots of features, right? There's lots of things that people would like to see in Loki. Is this one really important? Is this a real deal breaker for people? Because it absolutely sounds like it is. Like I don't disbelieve people when they say that they can't use Loki because of this, right? Like, I mean, maybe they're being a little melodramatic, but I still think it's significant enough that they take the time to give that feedback. So I guess that's the hard question to answer, right? We always sort of look at like, how do we, I guess we do have an issue for it, but, oh no, that's something else. I got to look to see what issue we have for it.
Yeah, it might warrant us putting it up on the community site, for instance. I think that's fine. I mean, there's also been some discussion about how we can actually implement this cheaply. But like, I don't really want to kind of go down that road here.
Does it involve sampling?
Yeah, I mean, basically, right? It's like storing more stuff in our index.
Yeah, so right, the one obvious one that we've talked about is that you could store in the index some amount of rate, but where that immediately falls apart is as soon as you add a filter expression to a query, you are now returning a much smaller subset of data than what the index knows about, right? So that histogram won't be accurately reflected as soon as you add a filter expression. And so that's where we just don't know, right? Because we don't index this. And I think that's the difference here, right? Like different solutions will have an index that's more helpful than us. So this is a definite case where Loki's design makes this a hard problem for us, where other systems it's not. And so that's, I think getting feedback, right? Like having a clear issue here in GitHub that we can sort of use to solicit feedback, and maybe posting that in a few places, but just to gather use cases and really ask this question, right? Of is this more important than removing the ordering constraint from Loki? Is this more important than a streaming query API or custom retention or deletes? So giving it some context, right? And that's other thing we can do is help provide a little bit better roadmap of the things that we think are towards the top. It is an interesting and sort of difficult problem to get feedback from a community that we don't, we have sort of limited avenues of contact with.
I find it, and I think my users from my team find it useful, or they want to find it useful for the sense of like, I've done a search, but because the histogram is bound to the amount of lines, they're suddenly like, now I have to go fiddle with the time, the time picker.
Yeah.
To see like, well, did this happen earlier? Because we're frequently diving into logs of like, we know a thing happened, but the user of our system just gave us a vague like, oh, it happened around 10 o'clock, so
Gotcha.
So
Yeah.
We're like, well, that could mean anything, right? So narrowing in the window of, okay, they gave me, they're doing this type of action, when did these happen? It's a lot to look through, and being able to. So they sometimes will look at the histogram of like, oh yeah, there is kind of a tight cluster right here. Maybe that's when they meant.
Yeah, it's just a modified time picker for us. The histogram is just like a way to select time in a different user experience than like manually selecting timestamps, basically.
I've often like I don't even mind the line limit. I know people complain about it, and because I help field questions for it for you guys sometimes too. I'm like, no, that's by design. It's by design. It's not broken. But yeah, when you hit the limit like real fast because something's churning out logs at a high rate, I've often wished like, I wish there was just like an arrow on the histogram that I could scroll to the next like 10-minute chunk or something,
Oh, that's a good idea.
And the pagination would probably get us there, but yeah, because otherwise you're just constantly screwing with like, well, okay, let me go change the time window.
What you suggested there was, so I want to start by thanking Zach, Chance, both of you, because I think I just did a really poor job of setting a stage for a good discussion there. In an attempt to maybe be a little humorous, I feel like I wasn't very open about having that discussion. So I really appreciate both of you, stepping up to tell us about your experiences here, because out of that, right, like what you just suggested is a really interesting idea, right? Like, what about an on-demand button for fulfilling the histogram out, right? My reluctancy of having it submit that query with every request is that that's wasted sort of compute, right? Like if people don't need the histogram, but an easy way to populate the histogram might be a really nice compromise here, right? Like, pagination would certainly help too. I'm thinking about that. So, but yeah, and Chance, to your point, right? Like as a sort of improved time picker. I mean, I guess I'm lying if I say I've literally never done this, right? Like I've never used that, right? Like I think I've found it, and maybe I find it's not useful because it's clearly not useful the way it works today, right? A little bit of a bias on my part for sure.
Yeah, I suspect that folks who have really well-structured logs probably are like, no, I just search for the thing I want and I get it and I'm good to go. And, I do it. But then, I have applications that even if they're like, oh, yep, we've structured the logs for our application, they've got 4 different middleware in their Go app and they log in different ways and nobody knows how to control it. So like, yeah, the more mixed your log sources are, the worse it gets.
Notes about what I was saying there. Awesome. I appreciate that discussion. I actually really enjoyed it. Yeah,
this is why we have community calls so that we can hear from the community. So anything else on this subject or really any others? And by the way, if Zach, I posted to you in the chat, but this goes for everybody. If you have problems that Grafana is not helping you with, post in the Grafana fails channel on the public Slack, because the UX team monitors that, and there's a reasonable chance that they will reach out to you for follow-up and for user research, because we do have, the UX team does like to talk to people who are using our software to find out how to make it better.
I am cross-posting an error there as we speak.
just one though, Zach. Not too many, man.
Yeah, just one today. Hopefully it's easy.
Just like just one ever, really. You know, just
Yeah, Grafana fails is like it's helpful that channel exists, right? And then
but
every now and then,
nobody knows what to put there.
You'll get. I hate getting like personally added in that channel. And being like, what did I do this time? Right? Like what?
Yeah. Well, don't think of it as you did something wrong. Think of it as you can help. Someone thinks you can help, Owen. Because you know stuff.
Yeah, thanks. That's definitely a silver lining.
I'd also like to note that what you're writing right now in the bullet points is basically exactly what I was thinking when you talked about the button, or just like
I love this idea.
Taking the work out of it and making it an opt-in instead of an opt-out, I guess, for the performance aspect has always been something I kind of was like, well, if I can click the button, why do you care? Like I'm going to write that rate query one way or another, right? And so the query will get run.
You can't stop me from writing a rate query. By the way, is this one of those rate versus irate things where does that matter, or am I just completely wrong?
Loki doesn't have an irate, so we don't have that problem. But.
That's a good question though, because I use count over time actually more than I use rate these days because of log lines being a little bit more sensical than logged line rates. So that's something to consider possibly. In fact, I bet
do you do that with really small intervals? Like, do you count over time 1 minute?
Yeah, usually it's quite a short interval.
Okay.
And that's just because log lines, I don't want them to have to look at a big buffer anyway. Usually, I can go as low resolution as I want with Loki as opposed to metrics.
Yeah, that's definitely an advantage there. Yeah, I guess for a little bit of context on the irate stuff, irate's generally helpful when you have things that change very quickly. Am I getting that right?
Or you have a system that approximates,
and
you don't have a system like Loki that just knows.
Brian Brazil has said that for visualizations, irate is better because you see the spikes at a smaller rate interval, and that rate is better for alarms. So that's where I use them differently.
Yeah, I usually am pretty lazy and just use rate most of the time. And then there's definitely been a couple of times where I've had to get my hands dirty and go down the irate hole and read the docs, again, figure out what this thing's for.
Oh, that reminds me. Another change you might have noticed in the Loki docs is that now the Loki docs all have an edit this page and provide feedback link in the sidebar. So if you spot an error or a typo or something, or have a suggestion, it is now easier to provide those.
That also reminds me that we're hiring a tech writer dedicated to the Loki project. So we are going to iterate over the docs soon enough to the big areas that I want. I think that we missed, right, are good kind of getting started and how to. And it's just, I don't know. What did I find today that was if you go to the clients section, there's a section at the bottom which doesn't actually format correctly too, but it talks about third-party clients, and there's this thing there saying that the push API is not stable yet, so clients can change this. The push API is extremely stable. There's zero risk of change to the push API. Documentation, huh? It's hard.
By the way, I had no idea that we had a edit this page link that'll automatically go to GitHub for you and do that. That's so great.
Yeah, it's been in the Grafana OSS since forever, but we recently applied it to exactly like that to other OSS documentation that we have, like Loki and Tempo, and we added an email feedback link in our non-open source products so that people can give us feedback on all of our documentation pages. So that made the writers happy, and we're hoping to, get more feedback and keep iterating and making docs better.
Yeah. Thanks. That's awesome.
Do we have a sec to go for me to ask about log QL histograms?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I just
So I
reread
think I
this
talked
one.
to Owen about this, but the context is basically you can do this in Promptail, so that's cool. But sometimes I want to, adjust my histogram buckets, and it'd be cool to be able to do this at runtime with a query. I kind of just expect it to work like any metric query, where it counts up the values that are less than a particular value across the entire time range. I think the biggest part would be like, how do you do that against a label instead of the value of, which usually it's on the value of a metric or something, right? So that can be where it's challenging, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, we can generate the quantile like Owen was talking about here.
Right. And that would also be nice. But specifically, I'm thinking like, I want, like most of our use cases are, we have these RPC jobs. They are incredibly frequent, and it would be great to just be able to categorize them by like their latencies or durations. And right now, most of our graphs use averages or something like totals basically over time. And we just kind of eyeball to see if there's any weird abnormalities in that, but it's much harder to, diagnose that way.
What kind of visualization did you have in mind? Like what would be a helpful visualization for you here?
I'm trying to remember what we used. We actually used to do this in CloudWatch, and then we migrated all of that to Loki and just kind of accepted some of the feature gaps.
Yeah, I mean a heat map, I guess.
I think we used like a basic bar chart histogram style histogram, where it's just like cumulative values, where each bar is just like, this is from 0 to 1, and this is from 1 to 5, or I guess it'd be less than.
Yeah, so
yeah, I think we used the regular Grafana histograms though for that at one point, and we have some of that on like our metrics, of course, that we have. But this is mostly the reason we don't have this as metrics is it's all high cardinality stuff for like per tenant RPCs, and so doing it at the query time would make the most sense for this.
I'm just trying to think of where I have an example of a histogram in an
existing one. Yeah.
So the heat map was what I was.
Oh yeah, actually, I think we did use the heat map at one point for this.
Yeah, because this would be one area there's no way to generate this from Loki right now.
Right.
And if you had a way to actually return buckets with counts in them, then you probably could. So that would be kind of interesting.
Right. Yeah, it's basically this kind of thing where.
So I mean, you could create. Yeah. I think there's a way I don't know if I've ever been successful in making a bar chart show histogram.
I think you can do this, but it's incredibly, incredibly painful. Like I remember talking to Owen, and it's like, you can do lots and lots of comparisons and like produce labels from that, but it's like, you're going to be basically doing the like less than or equal to bounds for each bucket by hand. And I remember the exercise was like, wow, this is going to be like a page long to get like 5 buckets.
You're going to have like auto generate your queries.
Yeah.
Terrifying.
I mean, it sounds like you can do it. I feel like where's the close won't fix.
One thing you guys might think about, so there's currently a bar chart alpha panel. The beta of that will be released in Grafana 8. And since we can now treat Loki logs like metrics in Grafana, you might be able to, there might be some more possibilities for doing what you're talking about a little bit less painfully when Grafana 8 rolls out in a couple of months.
I've actually just been using the Prometheus data source on Grafana on Loki for anything that requires Prometheus.
I still do this too. There's a few gaps that we haven't closed. Like you can't use range in the the $_ in
Yeah.
the Loki data source. You can't force the step in explore there's a couple things here that we need to button up to get that experience to be, but you're right. So like, and that's, if anybody's watching this, any future people out there that are watching this, Loki presents a Prometheus compatible API, so you can add Loki as a Prometheus data source. You just have to put /Loki after the URL when you specify the URL to your Loki server. So as you add the Prometheus data source, you just put /Loki in there. So like, localhost 3100, if you're running locally /Loki, and it will work as a Prometheus data source. And then that lets you use some of the things that Prometheus can do in Grafana until we close all those.
Yeah, we use
that in the docs.
Probably.
Okay, because if it's not, we should make a note and add them to the docs, because that is great information.
For what it's worth, this used to be the de facto way
Yeah.
to run Loki, to get metrics out of Loki, right? Before Grafana had like better like native Loki support, and you could select Loki as a data source and do metric queries and stuff, right? Like that. This is how you would get metrics out of Loki back in the day. It's interesting that there is still some use cases where that's actually like advantageous. Like I hadn't really unpacked that.
Those are the ones that I've come. Oh, like basically the $_range doesn't expand. That's the one that I most often run up against. And then I think in Explorer, sometimes I want to force the step, and you can't do that in Explorer with Loki.
I think there's also been some kind of unrelated. There's been some talk about mixing Loki and like different data source types in Explorer together. Because like one of the things that I want right now is like I'll look at Loki and I'll like generate metrics with some query, and then I want to overlay those against like Prometheus, right? Especially when I'm like doing like incident analysis, right? And I'm like trying to figure out like, all right, well, when did this start versus when did this start, whatever. And like right now, you basically need to like copy the time ranges up top over to like a separate window, run the same queries. Like it's just not great. I definitely think that there is some talk about that from the Explorer team. So.
Okay.
Be good.
We're kind of out of time because we screwed around for a long time before we started this. But I think I have a few more minutes if anyone has anything else we want to chat about.
That was all I had.
Thanks, Chance. Thanks, Zach. Appreciate you all joining and participating. Makes it more fun for us. Thanks, Diana and Owen. And thanks, Ed. You did a great job.
You did a great job, Ed. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks Bulbasaur.
Bye, guys.
Take care, y'all.